I want to point out, Lama Tsongkhapa says, in his Lam Rim, he says, contemplate these points again and again. Right? So that's what we're starting to do, right? As soon as we just keep going over these and contemplating them, giving rise to a feeling. And I want to mention too, like, refuge is a very, like, I don't think refuge is, I mean, obviously there are points to memorize and contemplate, but you get the feeling, refuge particularly, it should be an emotional experience to some extent, right? In other words, if it works, you know, as I was doing this just now, I was thinking of, like, you know, there are other metaphors, right? Like if you imagine being, I was thinking of, like, there's a metaphor in some commentary, but if you imagine being a death row inmate, right? And, like, think of how desolate that would feel, right? Like nobody cares about you, right? Like and you're gonna die, right? In a frightening way. And then the governor shows up, right? Like, who can pardon you. That's the feeling. That's a feeling that they use sometimes to describe what it feels like to take refuge, right? This sense of, like, where without the help of that person, it's totally a hopeless case. Right? You're already convicted. You're already, like, whatever, appealed or something like that. But this person has the power to, just by signing a piece of paper, like, you can be free, right? Through the relationship with them, you can be freed. You know what I mean? That's one metaphor they use sometimes. Another metaphor they sometimes use, like, is, you know, if you imagine, like, being in let's say you were overseas somewhere, right, and a war broke out, right? And if you're an American citizen, but you're in a place where there's a war, right? And if you get to the embassy, right, and there are, like, sort of, like, you run in and there are, like, whatever, the Marines who guard the embassies, and you go inside, right, and there's the ambassador there, and they say, don't worry, we have helicopters coming. Like, some feeling of, like, it's a really desperate situation, but there's somebody who has the power. The metaphors are that there's somebody who has the power to help you, is the idea, right? But it's supposed to be I mean, the idea is to cultivate that kind of experience. Does that make sense? I'm just trying to use different metaphors to explain, like, what the text are saying is, like, it's to give rise to an experience like that. Does that kind of make sense? So I'm just, you know, different ways to think about it. Anyway, any comments or questions? I'll say a couple more things.
I almost tend to think from my personal experiences that unless you have a deep awareness about suffering and understanding of suffering, you wouldn't be able to generate that deep amount of faith that you need. So you got to have that suffering and what suffering is before you can generate deep faith.
That's right. Yeah, so that's why you have to cultivate. And if you see, each time we're doing two, right? First you think about suffering, and then you think about the qualities of the Buddha, or Dharma and Sangha. You know, particularly emphasizes the Buddha here, but the three jewels. And so you have to contemplate both to give rise to refuge. It's not enough just to think of the qualities of the Buddha.
That'd be blind at that point. I mean, unless you have contemplated enough to get there.
Yeah, and there's no. Then you don't recognize your. So you say it, like, your need for that. In other words, like, it has to be personal, right? In other words, that you need the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha. Otherwise, it's like, oh, okay, they have good qualities. Like, you know, I was saying that as my own contemplation at one point. I thought the feeling shouldn't be like, let's just say this. You know, if you read, like, I remember as a kid, or you read a Superman comic, right? It's not like that. You know, oh, cool, Superman's cool, right? That's not the metaphors they use. You know what I mean? Like, where it's like, oh, the qualities. If you just think about the qualities and they're not related to your own suffering, that's my example where I was thinking, oh, then it would feel like that. Like, oh, cool, Superman flew and he did this. It's like, it feels like just a story then. But when you're relating it to your own experience of suffering, it's not like somebody else's story. It's a relationship for oneself. And that's the other thing, right? Because it's a relationship. And so it has to relate to your own suffering and to the suffering of others, actually. And we didn't get there yet. It's like contemplation. But yeah, so it has to grow out of fear, in that sense. Fear of suffering.
I don't know about fear, though. Fear, probably, I don't know. How do you define fear in this context?
Actually, it's interesting. In Buddhist psychology, right, they talk about, it's interesting, like, there are certain states of mind that are considered to be, there are certain, like, emotional, like they call them, I'll call them emotions, they don't use that word, but some are considered by their nature negative, like anger. Some are considered by their nature positive, like loving kindness. And some are changeable. And so the idea is that fear is sometimes a virtuous state of mind and sometimes a non-virtuous state of mind. And so, for example, like on the one hand, I'll give an example of a non-virtuous fear. If I think like it would be good to take some responsibility for helping others, and then I think, oh, but I'm afraid to do that. It might be too much work for me. Right? That's a non-virtuous fear. Right? It's a fear that's stopping me from being engaged in kindness. But what they say is there's also virtuous fear. And so like an example of a virtuous fear is realistic. The idea is in Buddhism is that a virtuous fear is a realistic fear that moves you towards a positive thing. That's really the idea. And so the idea would be, for example, the fear of lower realms. That's the one we were working on, right? Where they say actually, even Khenpo Rinpoche, he said, we're Mahayana. Maybe we come here and we're interested in Mahayana Buddhism. And then he says, but actually at our level, if we're not afraid of the lower realms, given how much negative karma we create, then that's foolish, actually. He's like, that's not realistic. Actually, we should be afraid of the lower. He's saying, like, until you've, there's a point on the, on the 5 paths, right? The path of accumulation and the path of preparation. And at one level of the path of preparation, the bodhisattva no longer can go to lower realms, And so if one has achieved that level, then there's no more need. Then that would be a waste of time to be afraid of something for yourself, because you're free from that. You know what I mean? But what Rinpoche was saying was that basically until you've achieved that level of the path, you should be afraid of lower realms because it's realistic. In other words, you could go there, and that helps motivate you to purify your negative karma, to take refuge, to avoid the non-virtuous actions. So the idea is that a healthy fear, a positive fear, is first of all it's realistic, and secondly it motivates you to take action. And to do actions to therefore avoid that bad circumstance, and that's considered a healthy kind of fear. So that's what. Does that make sense? And so so Khenpo Rinpoche was saying sometimes if people say, "Oh, I'm not afraid," or something like, he actually said that's, and then they think that's with some kind of pride. He said actually that's foolishness. Then it'd be like somebody who never. What's the word? If somebody were, what's the word like? To use a more like conventional or everyday metaphor or something, it's like if somebody said, if somebody's let's say somebody's in their 50s and they say, I'm not afraid, I don't need health insurance, I don't care, I'm fine. It's like, well, do you have a lot of money saved up in case you get sick? No, I'll be fine, I'm not ever going to get sick. It's a little bit of, or like if somebody's 65 and they say, I haven't started saving for retirement yet. It'll be okay. That's, in other words, like, what Khenpo was saying is that, like, it would be like that, right? Whereas it's like, it's not realistic. There's something unrealistic. There are certain things we should be concerned about, because they're realistic things to worry about. And the lower realms is a particularly important one. Because if somebody, and what they say, right, is if somebody says, I want to practice the bodhisattva path, but if you haven't achieved that level of the path of preparation, then what are you, like, they point out, then if you go to lower realms, you can't help anybody anyway. And you're just miserable and useless to others also. You're useless to yourself and you're useless to others, so there's no benefit. So then we should be afraid in that sense. But then they say you give up that fear when you achieve that level. Then, once the bodhisattvas achieve that, then they can say, now I'm no longer afraid. They can still be afraid for others to suffer, but they stop being afraid for themselves at that point of that suffering. But until then, we're supposed to, actually it's healthy. That's the idea. Other questions? Maybe I'll say one more comment. I just want to say one more thing and then we'll meditate again. I was also I mentioned this, I'm actually reading it, I was thinking about it a lot recently. Those 3, I mentioned just briefly, the 3 kinds of faith that Khenpo Rinpoche, he actually mentions it in the Easy Path book. And he had taught it, and I edited it, so I typed it in there, but I was like, I don't think I had totally understood it, and then I was thinking more about it. And I just thought, oh wow, look at, like, so I just want to actually has to think about it a minute. So he says the first kind, each one is more advanced. So he says the most basic level of faith, in a sense, which I forget, he calls it pure faith, is where you actually do feel. I mean, it's real faith, right? So you feel the sense of the Buddha has these amazing, wonderful qualities. The Buddha's teachings are amazing and great, and I want to internalize them. I want to become more like the Buddha. So that's quite profound already, isn't it? And that's the basic level of faith for taking refuge. But then Rinpoche says, then there are more advanced levels as you continue to contemplate. So think about that, right? So you already feel a relationship to the Buddha, right? that the Buddha has these wonderful qualities, that those qualities can liberate me and others from suffering, and I want to internalize them, and I want to become more like that. But then Rinpoche says, then there's a deeper kind of faith, where he says it's like the child, where a child falls down, right? Because so if you watch like in the park, like if you're in a park, right, at this time of year, if you go outside, and you see like a child and a mother who have a good relationship, and then the child falls down, right? As soon as they fall down, they look to their mom, ah, like right at their mother's face, and directly in her direction, and they have total faith that she's going to come help them, right? It's like a deeper, like, let's say it. There, it's not just some like through contemplation, right? There's a relationship, you know what I mean? It's a deeper kind of relationship that comes out of experience. That's what Rinpoche was pointing out. He says that child has been, because there's the child who does that, it's because from the moment, even before they were born, up to that moment, right? The mother has always been there for them, right? And so immediately they turn to her, right? And what he's saying is that I think what Rinpoche is saying is that if you take refuge deeply and you continue practicing, you reach a point where you have this relationship with the Buddha, where you actually, it's no longer just from contemplation, it's experiential, right? Where you felt the benefits of that relationship, and so then when hard times come, you don't have to think, oh, what's the qualities of the Buddha and all that. It comes from your experience of having been helped so much and having this deep relationship with the Buddha, where your mind immediately goes to what's the Buddha's advice? What would the Buddha say? You know, you visualize the Buddha and think, oh, okay, I'm safe, I'm okay. And then you have so much peace, is the idea, in your heart, right, from that. And then Rinpoche says the final level of faith, the deepest level of faith, that's where he says, it's like the person drinking who's thirsty and they think to drink water. I thought that's different even than the mother, right? Because the mother you have to rely on, right? The child relies on, but also the mother's not always going to be there. Right? And sometimes the mother could be sick, or the mother could be distracted. Right? But like water, let's just say it, it's the very nature of water to quench thirst, right? Like you don't have to think, will this water quench thirst, or is it too distracted? Or is the water sleeping right now, or something, right? Like, the water is always, what's there say? It's like, and so it would be like this, let's just say, almost like an absolute faith, right, from experience at that point. I mean, Rinpoche was I think he was using different metaphors, but it's like this thing where, you know, and even like, I don't know, like, there's no, you don't even think about it actually, right? It's like you don't even have to think, oh, does water quench thirst, right? Like, that's not even, it's not nothing, it's like it's so known to be the nature of your relationship to water that it's automatic. And he said at the most advanced level of faith, it's like that, where the practitioner or the person experiences the relationship to the Buddha like that. So I just thought that's interesting to contemplate in terms of refuge, right? That there are these different levels of kind of relatedness. And I just want to emphasize that point, that refuge is a relationship, right? And so if it feels to us, I just think because sometimes we can get that wrong and not know that. And I'll just say, like, I remember that first dawning on me to some extent was Geshe Silga. Remember him, Jeff? Like, he used to come to the teaching. And he was like that, where as soon as something would go, as soon as like there was any difficulty, you could see, he said this to me, he said, he immediately would think of Tara, the Buddha Tara. And like whatever the difficulty was, his heart would go immediately to Tara, without any second of hesitation. It was like, that was his refuge. Right? And then he felt also, you could see the quality that he got from that, of feeling at ease. It wasn't that he believed some magical thing, like that, you know, if he needed, whatever, you know, that if he wanted $10 to buy a sandwich, Tara would drop $10 in it. It wasn't like that. But there was an absolute faith that Tara would bring him peace of mind and would make his life meaningful. His relationship to the Buddha would make his life meaningful and satisfying and peaceful. And that was his experience, and I could see it. I was like, oh wow, that's what refuge does. So I'm just saying that, and then you see how refuge is a very deep topic, right, with different levels of depth to it, and different levels of our relationship to the Buddha. Does that make sense? I just wanted to mention that, because I think, otherwise people could think, oh, it's just saying these words, or it's just like, you know, oh, Buddhists say Namo. You know, if you go to like a prayer ceremony, right, sometimes like, then everyone say Namo, we did it, right, Namo Buddhaya, Namo Dharma. But, actually those are words, but that's not refuge, right? I mean, that's the words of refuge. But the real refuge is that feeling of it's a relationship to the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, right? And where that becomes the basic relationship of your life, actually, right? So even at the moment of death, you'll think of the refuge. That make sense? Like, you're cultivating a kind of relationship so that you feel like, and that's where they say somebody who really has refuge isn't afraid of death, right? You know that teaching where they say the most, what is it? I forget, what are those three? Like the most advanced practitioners become enlightened in this life, the middle life, whatever, something like that. But anyway, basically, if you have refuge, they say you're not afraid at the time of death. Does that make sense? Because you have a relationship. Actually, that's the one relationship that can go with you. No other relationship goes with you when you die, right? You leave behind your children, spouse, your parents. But you actually don't, it's just wherever, yeah, the Buddha's everywhere in that sense. So even the Buddha, you don't, in that sense, you leave behind your Buddha statues, but you don't leave behind the Buddha. Does that make sense? So I went off a little tangent. But does that make sense? Any questions about that? I just want to emphasize this point about the relational part of it, that it's not theoretical, it's really a relational practice.
Yeah, His Holiness mentioned in one of the books, but he used different wordings for 3 types of faith. I believe he called it faith of clear light, which should be the advanced faith. He used faith of refuse for the preliminary, the lower scope, and I think he used faith of conviction for the one with the practice.
So I have a question for you guys. We'll do one more round now of meditation. And here's my question. Like, I want to ask you your guys' input on. So we could either, in terms of the fear part, like we did the fear just of the lower realms, then we did the fear of the lower realms and samsara. The reason why I'm hesitant is the Lam Rim doesn't mention this actually. So the Lam Rim just focuses on those kinds of fear. There is another kind of refuge, specifically the Great Scope or Mahayana refuge, where you include those others. You include the fear of lower realms, the fear of samsara, but you also include the fear of others' suffering. So it's compassion in that sense. That is a form of refuge, right? It's Mahayana refuge, where you're not just taking refuge on behalf of your own, with fear for your own suffering, but also for the fear of others' suffering, right? With a sense of empathy and compassion for them. So we could do that one, or we could include that, but it's not specifically mentioned. Lama Tsongkhapa doesn't specifically mention it here in the Lam Rim, so we can include it or not. I mean, it's appropriate because it encompasses those others, so it's not like you're leaving those out. But or would people rather just keep going with what Lama Tsongkhapa actually mentions, the fear of the lower realms and the fear of samsara? I mean, actually, Lama Tsongkhapa really mentions mostly the fear of the lower realms, which is the same thing the Panchen Lama mentions here. Although at the very beginning, he says, in the very first verse we start, he says, from the state of an exalted, white, virtuous mind, I and all other sentient beings, vast as space, from this moment until our enlightenment go for refuge. There, Lama Tsongkhapa, what he says, an exalted, white, virtuous mind, there Lama Tsongkhapa is talking about, Panchen Lama is talking about bodhicitta. So he does mention it in the very first verse, or the second verse, of the Guru Puja that we do. So it's there in the Guru Puja. But if people have a preference, doesn't matter to me. Would you rather stay with what we've been doing, or add in the bodhicitta, the Mahayana aspect? You pick, Mike. What do you think?
Let's add it.
What's that? Okay. Okay, so you do it the other.
Why isn't it there?
What's that?
Why isn't it there?
Oh, because this isn't a low scope. So in other words, that would get included in like it's in the Guru Puja, for example, at the very beginning. But the idea is that if you look at like in the refuge section, we're in the low scope section of the Lam Rim, and so it's not bringing so actually in the preliminaries it can mention bodhicitta. In the preliminaries so that's just like in the Guru Puja. In the preliminary section, it'll mention bodhicitta in connection with refuge. But now we're in the low scope section, so where it talks about like suffering in lower realm, impermanence and death, and then suffering in lower realms, refuge, and karma. So right now we're focusing on the practice in common with the low scope. So that actually when I added in the suffering of samsara, that's actually not low scope, that's middle scope. Right? So actually I added something in at that point, which actually Lama Tsongkhapa doesn't explicitly mention that. The commentaries do, so that's why he's very strict about keeping the low scope, the middle scope, and the great scope. So when you get to the great scope, you would add that in.